Okay, so this chapter today is going to be focusing on what is sometimes called the Jacksonian Democracy period, or sort of more time period related. This would be a period from roughly, let's say the mid 18 teens, so right after the War of 1812, and moving up till about the 1840s or so. This period is interesting because the United States now, by 18 teens, after the War of 1812, and after sort of as we get into the 1820s, the United States has sort of settled out, right? All of the struggles that had gone on in the early Republic period with trying to, show the strength of the federal government and trying to defend itself from transatlantic incursions. You have the quasi-war, you have invasions by the French and incursions by the British. That has sort of subsided, and the United States now can start defining itself as what makes us American, or what makes us different from other groups. So this period is a period where the United States is attempting to do that. Secondly, the other important part of this is now with this newfound security, the United States is also starting to establish itself as a is starting to define itself, within its own borders, right? We need to start building infrastructure. The government needs to start establishing ways to protect its interior, right? So all of these things have to happen. And that's what it sort of marks one of the highlights of this period. All right. So, as I said a moment ago, really what the important piece of this is that you are starting to have a unified nation, a nation that is defining itself as against or different from other groups of people. So that there's a defined national literature where you have certain people writing about quote unquote American experiences. So you have people like Washington Irving of Tarrytown fame, right? The Headless Horseman, James Fenimore Cooper, writing about the sort of experiences of the United States. Even more importantly, though, you have the Webster brothers, right, from Connecticut, right? I guess you have Daniel Webster, most particularly, right, who is the person who comes up with Webster's dictionary, right, the person who sort of defines Americanisms, right? And the importance there is to define sort of what is American English. You have American history textbooks emerging, right? And they're starting to define, again, their own sort of American narrative of our story. We are also in a period where this is sort of the Industrial Revolution is going on, right? So the United States, just like Britain and France, and to a lesser extent Germany, what would become Germany, are starting, or are very much in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. So you have things like the factories emerging, you have the railroad system, you have different types of industrial production going out and being made here. So once we get into the mid 18 teens, really the important feature here, as I said, is the United States is starting to defend itself from other parts of the world. So in the 18 teens, the United States government establishes what is called the American system. Now, the American system, as I say, is again this way that the United States is trying to protect itself. So they start. One of the first things that happens is there is the establishment of a tariff of about 20 to 25% on all goods coming from outside of the United States. Now, the important thing to see with this is going to stop things like manufactured goods from Britain, manufactured goods from France, flooding the American market. Now, they're probably cheaper because they have much more output potential than the United States would have. And in the United States, you have smaller groups of people who are producing, so the products are going to be a little bit more expensive. So what happens is with the tariff, the goal here is to try and make American goods cheaper than imported goods. And the purpose of this is to really help out local American production. Now, the problem with this, at least from an American perspective, the United States perspective, is in the South, right? This is still the period of antebellum, before Civil War, slavery. The South is very agriculturally focused. And because of that, the North, which is more industrially focused, there's a growing tension between the North and the South because this tariff is seen as supporting the northern production and sort of ignoring the South because things are becoming more expensive. So Henry Clay develops what's called the American system. There are three main parts of it. The first of it is to establish a banking system, have a centralized bank that can provide easy credit to all people in the United States, have a strong protective tariff, which I just described, and three, establish a strong system of internal infrastructure that can work as a way of moving goods across the country, right? So canals and roads, and ultimately railroads. Now, the purpose of this is because it's going to help both groups, right? It's going to help the industrialists, the people who are producing the goods in the North, but it's also going to help those people in the South move their agricultural goods. James Monroe also becomes the president in 1816. So James Madison was the president from the 1808 election up until the 1816 election, and then 1816 James Monroe wins, and he's president until 1824. I want to jump and talk a little bit of the sort of growth of the Western frontier, particularly within the context of this American system. So the American system is, again, a system of connecting all different parts of the country through infrastructure, through canals, through roads, and then ultimately through railroads. And the purpose of that is to again, can try and draw the country together, make trade easier, right? Because if I'm a farmer in South Carolina and it's easier for me to get my goods from backcountry South Carolina to Charleston and then across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe, I'm going to do that. But if I can have roads and canals that can connect me from Charleston and easily get my goods to, let's say, Baltimore, or even, God forbid, Philadelphia, that'll make things easier. So as the United States is moving west, connection to the east is important. And another part of that is we also need, and I say this here, right, we also need a place to put growing numbers of people. In the United States in the 1800s, there's a huge amount of immigration going on, that the United States population is expanding, again, largely in the north because they have the bigger cities and they have industrial capacity to do so. But we also need to start opening up the lands. So people are moving west, and we again need to connect in. It's also another portion of this, and I don't necessarily say this here, but the other piece is that you still, fine, you have the Louisiana territory, but the fear is that if you don't sort of put settlers there, Spain can start moving in, and there is a still concern about that. Along with all of this, you also have the major issue of slavery. Slavery is a huge, obviously, problem within the United States. You have half the country, particularly the southern half, that is remaining very much connected to the institution of slavery. Their entire economy is indeed based off of it. But in the North, that's not the case, right? In northern states, you have groups of people, you have industrial workers, you have people who are working in factories, or at least in production, that are not slaves and they're making their own money. So there's a major balance issue. By this point, there are 11 free states in the country. There are 11 slave states in the country. So the balance is at least in the Senate, is balanced. You have 22 slave represented states, 22 senators, and then 22 senators from free states. However, in 1819, the territory of Missouri applies to be a slave state. This would disrupt the balance, and for no and in the South, obviously, that's a desirable thing because then you would upset the balance. However, in the North, that is not appealing. So what happens is a compromise needs to be struck, and this is done by Henry Clay, sort of the famous senator from Kentucky, and it's the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise says that Missouri can enter in as a slave state, but a new free state must come in as well, and that's the state of Maine. Maine was a territory that had been established as part of Massachusetts, and it was broken away and brought into the country. So Maine comes in as a free state, Missouri comes in as a slave state. Now, what's important about this is it does a couple of things. Number one, it keeps the balance of slave versus free status quo. Second, it also says that below the 36th parallel, which is the southern border of Missouri, all slave states must stay below there. Now, why is that significant? For the northern states, there's a lot more of the Louisiana Territory up north, so it makes it so that the Northerners had more territory and it's sort of more appealing to them. But it also makes it so that as you head west, you sort of bump into, for Northerners, you bump into what would become Texas and all that. That's Spanish territory still. It won't be forever. What's important here, though, is this really, in a lot of ways, kicks the can down the road. It kicks the slave decision and the slave dispute, again, down the road. It basically says, we can't, we're not ready to make this decision now. This is what's going to. The other conflicting piece to this is that for the Northerners, because the North is so much more populated, the North also has greater amounts of people, and with that greater amounts of people, they have more people in the House of Representatives. So because of that, the South knew that they had to keep this the North happy. The last piece to this is judicial review and John Marshall. The final piece to this new American understanding of itself comes with how do we define the American legal structure. In the United States during this time, the Supreme Court had been established with John Jay and other Supreme Court justices in the early Republican period. However, the Supreme Court was not the court that we know of it today. The Supreme Court in the early 1800s was a group of men who basically traveled around as the federal representatives of the legal system on their circuits, hence why we have circuit courts, and they would occasionally meet for big decisions in Philadelphia. However, under John Marshall, it becomes a much more prestigious institution. John Marshall holds the position for 20 plus years, where other people had only held it, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, for a couple of years. John Jay was about 5 or so. And in 1819, a big decision comes in front of John Marshall, McCulloch v. Maryland. So the state of Maryland had one of the branches of the United States Bank in it. McCulloch was the chair of the bank. Maryland tried to destroy the Bank of the United States by imposing a tax. So ultimately what winds up happening is John Marshall makes a decision that says a state cannot tax the federal government, and the states can't can't try and damage the federal government. More importantly, the banks are allowed because the Constitution gives the United States government powers to grow. this establishes a couple things: supremacy of the national government, but even more importantly than with the supremacy of the national government, it also reaffirms judicial review. The Supreme Court can review court documents.